So it was really starting in late November, at the Vilnius summit, where there was this very disappointing to the Europeans denouement as Yanukovych refused to sign the agreement, which triggered the student protests, which then escalated after Yanukovych first sent the security forces in to beat them up at the end of November, beginning of December. And I think that's when people started to say, okay, this is a bit more serious, and we need to pay attention to this as potentially a mass movement. It kind of, went through December and the New Year, and there were these weekly Vice meetings, the kind of evening gatherings where the numbers on the Maidan would swell, and we kind of kept tabs on, who was speaking, what was the messaging, what was the relationship between the protesters and the opposition figures who were in the Rada, the parliament of Ukraine. And again, was this well organized? Did this present a real challenge to Yanukovych's leadership? Ironically, though, there is this Russian conspiracy narrative that it was the United States or the CIA, frankly, that engineered the so-called coup against Yanukovych. I can say for certainty that we had no idea what was going on. So it would have been very hard for us to engineer something where we literally had no clue what was going on. But the irony is that U.S. policy was actually focused on helping Yanukovych rescue himself from ruin. And when you look at all of the diplomacy of Toria Nuland, who was the assistant secretary of state at the time and would make frequent trips to Kyiv, the European foreign ministers who were heavily involved, Vice President Biden, who was talking to Yanukovych on the phone, they were pressing him to, respect human rights and the constitutional order, to release some of the political prisoners, to lift some of the restrictions. There had been this very draconian set of laws passed in the middle of January 16th, I think it was Black Thursday, when they pushed through these so-called dictatorship laws on the freedom of assembly and protest and so on. And again, what the U.S. government, the Obama administration, was trying to do was to get Yanukovych to make some sort of power-sharing arrangement with the opposition to defuse what we saw as this proto-revolutionary fervor. And at every step, Yanukovych, almost every step, he chose violence and brutalization, and it made the situation worse and worse. And, interestingly, from the Russian standpoint, they were frustrated that he wasn't more brutal. They thought he was only taking half measures, and they wanted to see him wipe the entire Maidan clean. From the U.S. side, of course, we were pushing for restraint. The Europeans were as well. But it was this sort of back and forth almost until the very last moment. And you saw in that final week of the Maidan, sort of the February 18th to 20th and 21st, where the violence just completely escalated, and you had 100 or so killed on the Maidan in the clashes. And of course, Yanukovych overplayed his hand in the end. And we had this deal, which was brokered by the European foreign ministers overnight, February 20th into the morning of the 21st, that Friday. It was the foreign ministers of Germany, France, and Poland, Steinmeier, Fabius, and Sikorski, who's currently still the foreign minister of Poland. And they had sat all night with Yanukovych and with the opposition, the parliamentary opposition, and were trying to hammer out this deal. Ultimately, they sort of brought the deal to the public. The opposition did, showed it to the Maidan, and got booed because it didn't go far enough. It didn't remove Yanukovych from power. It just sort of brought up the presidential election by, ultimately, it was about 3 months, and would have installed a sort of technocratic prime minister. That was the February 21st agreement. And incidentally, that afternoon, again, I remember this from when I was at the agency, President Obama and President Putin had a phone call, and they sort of both said, this is a pretty good agreement. We both sort of subscribe to this. We welcome what the European foreign ministers have done. It looks like it'll calm the situation and so on. And the Russians would later have the narrative that it was the United States that undercut the February 21st agreement. I mean, it's still something that you see them harping on now. There was this agreement and the United States subverted the whole thing. But at that moment, on the afternoon in Washington of February 21st, which was already the early evening in Kyiv, the U.S. government, the Obama administration, was fully on board with this agreement. But it was the simultaneous fact that the opposition faced very stiff resistance from the protesters on the Maidan, who had just lost, 100 or so of their friends and loved ones. And more importantly, the fact that Yanukovych left the city. He left the city, and there's subsequently been reporting by Ukrainian investigative journalists that already in the days prior, he and his security detail were taking artwork out of his residence and so on. So he clearly planned to flee in some respect. I don't know if he planned to flee the country necessarily, but certainly to get out of Dodge, to get out of Kyiv for a little while. But when he did that, it had the effect of prompting the Ukrainian security forces that were guarding government buildings to just sort of melt away. So by that evening, there was no one left guarding the presidential administration, the cabinet of ministers, and so on. And so it was actually the Maidan sort of self-defense forces, self-organized groups that guarded these buildings to prevent them from being looted and to sort of keep basic order. And it was overnight at that time, the Friday into the Saturday, where Yanukovych was nowhere to be seen. And we all woke up in Washington Saturday morning like, what the heck just happened? And thus began really the saga of the subsequent 12 years. But again, just to show kind of the audience how this really did come out of nowhere. And, not only was the United States government not ready to deal with sort of the aftermath, but again, in Ukraine, their political system certainly wasn't ready for this. They adapted very quickly that weekend in dealing with the fact that their president was MIA. But the Russians also, it didn't seem, in retrospect, were ready for this either. So it came as a surprise to everyone this Saturday morning that we were looking at a new political reality in Kyiv.